Have you had a flu shot this year? It's designed to protect you against seasonal flu. But what if there was a far more dangerous virus lurking, spreading from person to person and country to country, with authorities struggling to work out how to stop it? There's no vaccine, at least not yet. How do you contain it? How do you treat those who have been infected? And how do global authorities work together to find the answers? Tonight, in a joint project with AsiaLink, the University of Melbourne and the Wheeler Centre, our expert panel will answer those questions in a hypothetical pandemic. What if disease X, the previously unknown pathogen warned of by the World Health Organization, has finally arrived?
The average person touches their face 3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doorknobs, water fountains, and each other.
It was a Hollywood blockbuster, a terrifying version of a global pandemic. But scientists say the 2011 film Contagion is also a close depiction of how an infectious disease outbreak could unfold. Just one cough and you have a catastrophic chain of transmission. You have to go back 100 years to find true global devastation. The Spanish flu of 1918, up to 1/3 of the world's population infected, more than 50 million dead. The only disease to rival that level of destruction since is HIV/AIDS. But there have been other fatal infections. In 1957, Asian flu killed up to 2 million. 10 years later, Hong Kong flu claimed an estimated 1 million. Then, in 2003, there was SARS.
The outbreak of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, is a chilling reminder of our frailty in the face of Mother Nature.
It is quite clear that it is a unique and novel virus. It's a virus that is new to science.
SARS was a wake-up call for many.
When China was dealing with SARS, it didn't know how to handle it. Since 2003, China has invested in improving its healthcare system, in improving, the information system, in reporting to World Health Organization, and being very transparent.
6 years later, swine flu arrived, another strain scientists had never seen before.
Authorities are desperate to test passengers who shared a Qantas flight with the woman who's become Australia's first confirmed swine flu case.
In the end, as a global pandemic, swine flu was relatively mild. Worldwide, it's thought to have killed more than 280,000 people. In Australia, there were 37,500 cases and 191 deaths. Since then, Ebola, MERS and the Zika virus have all made headlines. Now, for the first time, the World Health Organization has added Disease X to its watch list, a recognition that we don't know where the next pandemic will come from. But we do know that how we respond to it will be critical. If a newly emerged airborne virus appeared in Southeast Asia today, experts say we'd be likely to see 33 million dead in just 6 months. The modern world has had practice, but nothing on that scale. So to introduce our panel for tonight's hypothetical, Dr. Russell Basser is a qualified physician. He's also Senior Vice President of Research and Development at Seqirus, which is the second largest influenza vaccine maker in the world. It's wholly owned by CSL. Professor Kanta Subbarao is a virologist, a physician, and she's also director of the World Health Organization's Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza, based here in Melbourne. It's one of only 6 such centres in the world. Next to Kanta, we have Garry Lung, Dr. Garry Lung. He's the Principal Medical Advisor in the Office of Health Protection with the Federal Department of Health. He was the coordinator of the Incident Control Room during the swine flu pandemic in 2009, which means that he helped all the state, territory and the federal government get on the same page with how they were going to handle swine flu, and that is a role that he will reprise tonight with our hypothetical virus. Professor Malik Perez, Chair of Virology at the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. You may recognise Malik, not looking a day older than he did in that video where he was talking about SARS some 15 years ago. He played a key role in unravelling the mysteries of the SARS virus, and indeed also is very prominent in research around avian flu. And we thank him for joining us from Hong Kong tonight. Professor Sharon Lewin is the inaugural director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. She's also the chief investigator of the Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research of Infectious Disease Emergencies. And also tonight, she is a specialist infectious diseases consultant to the Alfred Hospital. Dr. Rod Pearce is a senior grassroots GP. He's a former president of the Australian Medical Association in South Australia, and he runs a series of clinics in Adelaide and also on the York Peninsula. That makes a total of 6 top physicians on the stage tonight, so if you're in the right place, if you're feeling sick, that's for sure. All our experts will be playing themselves for this hypothetical. Please welcome our panel. It's the 6th of September and news is starting to filter through of an influenza-like virus in southern China. 2 families in Wuzhou on the Xi River bordering Guangdong province have been affected. In all, there are about 30 suspected cases with 4 dead. The sick include 2 healthcare workers, a nurse and an orderly, who helped treat the worst affected members of this family in a local hospital. The first case is believed to date back about 2 weeks. Malik, you're in Hong Kong. You've been contacted by one of your colleagues in southern China. You've received a telephone call a little like this before, haven't you, with SARS?
Yes, I have received telephone calls like this, both from WHO alerting about SARS and from colleagues in Guangdong. Yeah.
So what do they tell you? I mean, they give you as much information as they can, which at this point is influenza-like symptoms, and obviously a lot of these patients have both been very ill and also there's a death rate. We have 4 dead and 30 cases in this particular 2 clusters.
So what you described just now with the cluster of infection and also healthcare workers being infected is something that we would always take very seriously. Of course, it could be a run-of-the-mill influenza outbreak, but 2 or 3 dead, as you mentioned, makes it a bit surprising. So I think we would certainly take that seriously, and we have a very close collaboration with the lab in Guangzhou, the state key lab for respiratory diseases, who are the sort of reference center for severe respiratory infections. So I would certainly contact them and find out what's going on, and if necessary, have them send people to investigate this outbreak.
Do you try and get a sample of this virus at this point?
So obviously the individual hospitals in China are quite independent. The statutory requirements would be, in the case of an outbreak, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Guangdong province, would have the responsibility to investigate that. So they would have the primary responsibility to go and look into that. We also have close connections with them. So we would also reach out to them to find out what's going on.
Kante, in Melbourne, you run one of only 6 WHO influenza collaboration centres in the world. How much do you know about this virus at the moment, and has the WHO managed to get its hands on a sample?
So we would rely on information that comes through either one of the collaborating centres. We're, as you said, one of 6. The others are in Beijing, in Tokyo, in London, Atlanta, and one for animal influenza in Memphis in the US. So we would first try to find out if anybody has received any information about this outbreak. And informally, we might reach out to Malik, who we know well, and we know that he's well connected. So we would make some inquiries on the side to see whether they're informally as well as the formal notifications.
So, Malik, You do manage to get a sample of this, at least into the laboratory in southern China that you have connections to, and very quickly you work out that this virus doesn't match any of the known subtypes of influenza. What happens then?
Yeah, so if it is not one of the seasonal H1H3 subtypes, and it's an influenza A virus, then by definition that constitutes an emergency. So that virus really needs to be fully characterized as soon as possible, 24/7.
And what does that mean?
So that means on the one hand, trying to culture the virus, grow it. On the other hand, trying to sequence the virus directly from the clinical specimen. And once you grow the virus, then you would sequence it from the culture as well.
So that's like the virus blueprint, if you like. If you can sequence this virus, you can work out exactly what it is.
Yeah, so that's the genetic information in the virus that would tell us the nature of the virus, whether it is H, X, N, Y, or whatever it is. And also, it would also tell us a number of other things, possibly tell us a number of other things about potential resistance to antivirals that we have, such as oseltamivir, zanamivir, sometimes markers of transmissibility in humans, and also sometimes markers of virulence. So there's a lot of information that we can get from the sequence. But at the end of the day, we really need the virus itself to characterize it biologically as well as genetically.
But I guess, Kante, if the virus is sequenced in Beijing, that's good enough, isn't it? Does anyone else have to sequence it as well?
So the sequence information is vital, and most of labs collaborate in a network where once the sequence is known, it's uploaded and shared widely.
Is China part of that network?
Absolutely. And so they have uploaded even these viruses that you're talking about, them not sharing the viruses. They're sharing the genetic sequence data. So that is very helpful. It's very informative. But as Malik said, we really need the virus in order to study the biology of the virus, to figure out in, say, in experimental animals, whether it causes severe disease and whether it spreads. And ultimately, to make an influenza vaccine, it is very helpful to have a virus isolate. So having the virus is also a big part of what we would try to go after.
So how do you rate your chances between the two of you? The WHO and Malik, your laboratories, do you think that within a week or so you've managed to get your hands on a virus?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, yes, under these circumstances, I think so. And I think the other point, just to extend from what Kante said, so if you do have the genetic sequence, nowadays you can actually synthesize the virus from the sequence. So we will be trying all these approaches at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, indeed, by the end of September, this disease has been identified. It's a form of bird flu, and it's been officially called fowl plague. That's fowl with a W, but you could in fact also use a U, because at that point that is a very accurate description. It's now travelled to Hong Kong, and there are also suspected cases in Hanoi in Vietnam, thought to be connected to a Chinese tour group. The story is starting to make news headlines.
A never-before-seen strain of influenza is believed to have killed more than 60 people in southern China and Hong Kong, with authorities now warning the disease, a form of bird flu, has spread to Vietnam. Over 700 people have been infected with the virus. Symptoms include high fever along with chest pain and diarrhoea. In some patients, the disease is said to progress quickly to severe respiratory illness and can also cause seizures. Authorities in China say they're confident the outbreak has been brought under control. However, there are no details available about the rate of new infections.
Well, Garry Lung, you're sitting in Canberra. There's a very well-established surveillance network for influenza. You're well aware of this new strain that's been in southern China. You know that it's in Hong Kong and Vietnam. You've just seen the news headlines, so you know now that all Australians know that as well. Are you starting to get a little bit worried?
We would definitely be concerned. So as soon as information was being shared freely about this particular virus and the disease that it was causing early in September, we would have had a range of information coming out through a variety of different mechanisms. So under the World Health Organisation, there's the International Health Regulations, the Office of Health Protection, where I work, is the national focal point, and there would be information sharing through the WHO. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Home Affairs each have watch offices. There's the Global Watch Office for DFAT and the Crisis Coordination Centre for Home Affairs. They would also be feeding in information. On top of that, there are epidemiologists in states and territories who take a keen interest on things happening overseas, as well as our own epidemiologists. And I would have thought that by the end of September, having heard what has happened, that the main constructs within the national approach to health protection, namely committees like the Public Health Laboratory Network and the Communicable Disease Network Australia, would certainly be at their level very interested in this, and there would have already been communication up through to the Chief Health Officers of states and territories as part of a construct known as the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee.
Now that's a lot of people and a lot of committees and a lot of busyness around this disease, but do you push the crisis button at this point and get your incident control room up and running, or we're not really there yet?
No, knowing that there is something significant happening overseas, and we would just be waiting to hear whether WHO is going to pull the trigger on a public health emergency of international concern, or if we were getting more information out of our other sources that made us more concerned, we might then step from the preparedness stage into the standby stage.
Well, while you're pondering all of that, Singapore becomes the first country to announce that it's putting in place border controls. It's fired up its thermal scanning at Changi Airport, and it's taking the temperature of everyone who's coming in as a precaution. And the reason for that is this disease is spreading fast. The 700 people that we heard about in the earlier news bulletin has now become thousands of cases, and more countries across Southeast Asia are also affected. Sharon Lewin, Singapore is obviously very concerned. The virus is causing a lot of worry. You're head of the Doherty Institute. You also advise at the Alfred Hospital. Are you starting to get concerned about this virus potentially coming to Australia?
We would definitely be concerned, and what usually happens is that specialists or GPs would be either getting communication from our state health departments or Commonwealth health departments about being alert for and guidance on what to look for. As an infectious diseases physician, travel history is incredibly important whenever you see someone with a febrile illness, and so we would already be thinking, making on high alert of countries that people may have potentially have visited. And that sort of happens in a range of different illnesses all the time.
Are you well prepared though at the Alfred Hospital? Is it something that you've got a button that you can push and Alfred is all pandemic prepared?
Is there a button to be pressed? Again, hospitals work very closely with state health departments, so no button gets pressed anywhere without discussions with the state health department. But increasing awareness, actually what we would do at the Frontline, even before we got any official recommendations, we would be speaking to people in emergency departments, raising awareness that we're hearing about these unusual, but potentially very serious flu, thousands of cases. These are the countries that it's in high alert at this stage. Beyond formal response, we would wait still for our government recommendations.
Rod, what about you? You're on the front line at GP clinics. You also keep an eye on these influenza surveillance mechanisms. You're watching pretty closely. Are you worried, and does your experience in 2009, you also went through the swine flu pandemic, does your experience then make you relaxed and comfortable about now?
No, far from it. I'd be contacting Sharon and maybe the Chief Medical Officer to say, what's going on? Is it as bad as they say? Is every chest pain that's just arrived from overseas now a flu? I'm getting nervous. I don't know what's going to happen at the front. And all of my patients are going to say, and starting to say, oh, they know someone who's just come back. Is this something they got to worry about? And it's changing our radar and making us nervous.
Russell, this looks like it might be a virus in need of a vaccine. Are we at that point yet?
No, because we'll be talking a bit like everybody else. We're talking informally through the networks that are already established. If you like, the yearly influenza season and the need to make a new vaccine every year is a dress rehearsal. That's why we see it. And so those networks exist. So we're speaking to Cantor and the WHO network, the government, about what they would like us to do. But in the background, we're also doing informal things like taking the sequence and reversibly engineering and trying to make a virus that we can use to grow the vaccine, to make the vaccine with. And if we can get access to a sample, we'll start to go through the process of preparing that seed that will then go into the vaccine manufacturing process to try and select the best seed for making the vaccine efficiently. So we're doing all this unofficially.
Would you start that vaccination process without a big kick along from the federal government, because it's a very, very expensive business to make a vaccine?
No. We're putting the elements in place that would ready us to do that as quickly as possible once the federal government said we need to go ahead with this.
Because you're contracted to them when it comes to this sort of vaccine.
Yeah, and I think this is a situation where to change strategy from annual seasonal vaccination to a completely new vaccine requires a more formal declaration of an emergency that WHO tends to lead internationally, but the government locally has to activate that for us to respond.
So question, if you did start today, September the 6th, very early on, how soon could you have a vaccine ready?
We could have a vaccine in a few caveats, probably about 5 months, 5 to 6 months. The problem with this...
That's best case scenario.
The problem with this new vaccine is that it's a brand new vaccine and we're going to have to do clinical trials because we won't know how it behaves in people. So how much you need to give, do you need to give 1 or 2 doses, what the safety profile is. There's things that we have to do to the vaccine or the virus that we use in manufacturing to make it safe. So if it's as bad as it sounds like it could be, it needs to be handled in very contained environments, which actually you can't manufacture under. So certain tests will need to be done. So there's all these steps that we need to go through to be able to get the vaccine out there. So at the moment, with the current technology, for minimum, maybe 5 to 6 months if things are hard.
Well, most Australians are blissfully unaware of that timeline at this point, and of course, the virus is yet to reach this country. But while various pandemic plans are being dusted off, there's a crisis at Sydney International Airport. A direct flight from Hanoi in Vietnam has landed, and the pilot has alerted authorities that he has 2 people on board who are showing distinct influenza-like symptoms. Garry, what happens now? It looks like this virus might have just hitched a ride to Australia.
So one of the current arrangements when the master of a vessel, be it an aeroplane or a ship, enters into Australia under what's known as the pratique processes, if the captain of that aircraft signals and says that we've got 2 ill passengers, knowing where they've come from and knowing the symptoms that were presented, under the Department of Agriculture, biosecurity officers would be deployed, and given the nature of the illness, there would also be human biosecurity officers from New South Wales Government. Department of Health would also probably be informed, and the Chief Human Biosecurity Officer for New South Wales, which is the Chief Health Officer, would also be informed of that situation. But
you've got 155 passengers and crew on this plane. Do you let them get off, take their phone number and tell them to go home, or do you try and quarantine them?
In that circumstance, depending on where we are in terms of the government planning, if we at that stage had already made the decision that we were going to start ramping up the border measures, there might already be in place modifications to the incoming passenger card. We may have already designed a health declaration card, and we may have also had in place the announcements in aeroplanes as they were coming into Australia. If that's the case, then it would be a matter of assessing those ill passengers, keeping the passengers probably for a short period of time just until the human biosecurity officers were satisfied or not that they had a problem at hand. If they felt that they did, then that might be necessary for those other passengers to have their details recorded and to be given some basic health advice in terms of respiratory illness.
Malik, how important is communication, particularly at these early stages? I know SARS in Hong Kong was well before social media was what it is today, but at that very outset, is providing the right message key?
Obviously, in this type of situation, you don't know all the facts, but you have to be accurate and say what is known and what is unknown, but you really have to be proactive. If not, essentially the rumor mill takes over. And during SARS, we didn't have, all this Twitter and all this stuff to that extent, but now it'll be a completely different ballgame. So really effective communication will be fundamental to managing this type of situation.
Well, things are moving very fast with our virus, and just one day after the crisis at Sydney's International Airport, foul plague is officially designated a pandemic, and not surprisingly, it's now the lead story on the news.
A new strain of influenza that first emerged in southern China has been declared a global pandemic. The World Health Organization made the official declaration today, with the disease known as foul plague spreading to Japan, Thailand, Cambodia, the Philippines and Canada. Across Asia, well over 10,000 people are thought to be infected, with an estimated 700 deaths. But authorities warn against making assumptions about the fatality rate because only the most severe cases seek medical help. The US and a number of European countries are now initiating border controls. It's the first global pandemic to be declared since swine flu in 2009.
Kanta, this is a decision that the WHO doesn't take lightly, isn't it?
That's correct. It's a very significant decision because there are implications through the international health regulations, there are implications on trade and travel and a lot of international interactions. So it's not made lightly, but as you've just talked about how many cases there have been and how widespread this is, and we may still be seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of case fatality. There may be a lot more illness out there.
It's very difficult at this stage, isn't it, to know just how contagious this particular virus is, because you know the sick people are turning up at the hospitals and at the doctors, but you don't know how many people are getting it but not becoming very sick.
Right. So what the WHO has recommended and was done in 2009 is to study the first 100 or the first few hundred cases in each country in great detail to try to learn more about the clinical illness, the range of clinical disease, the outcomes, the epidemiology, a little bit more about the virus and about the immune response, and who's particularly at risk for complications. So there is a suggestion that each country, as part of their pandemic preparedness, set up the ability to do such investigations of the first few hundred cases.
Well, of course, Australia is still relatively lucky. We have those cases that have come in on the plane, but that's all. There is some bad news, though, Malik. You find out fairly quickly that this virus is not responsive to antiviral drugs, in particular oseltamivir. What does that mean for the treatment process? Is that something that you would normally use to alleviate the symptoms?
Yeah, so managing influenza is, of course, symptomatic, but also antiviral drugs. And this is particularly important in patients who are more prone to develop severe complications.
Like pneumonia and that sort of thing.
And I mean, the more senior citizens, those who have other underlying complications already, so they are more likely to. So these patients really need to get treated and treated early, because the earlier you use this antiviral drug, the better outcome. So the fact, if this is the case, that it is resistant would be really a problem. But then there are other alternative drugs that are out there. So there's a very old drug called Amantadine, Rimantadine. Well, chances are it may be resistant to that as well, because many of the flu viruses we have now are resistant to that, but it will be still worth looking at that. There's another antiviral drug called zanamivir. So usually there is no cross-resistance, but sometimes to some extent. So all these things have to be ascertained as quickly as possible.
Garry, how does that declaration by the WHO change things for the Australian government? Do you now consider border controls, thermal scans at airports, going beyond just handing people an information card?
Yeah, definitely. So knowing that WHO has declared a pandemic means that because we've got a disease in the country that's caused by an influenza virus of pandemic potential, it formally meets the criteria as a listed human disease under Biosecurity Act 2015. That means we're in a position then to advise the Minister, who can then advise the Governor-General to declare a biosecurity emergency.
So what does that look like in practice? I mean, do thermal scanners even work?
So in terms of the border measures, everybody will remember those TV programs and shows showing thermal scanners where they've got the bright, pretty colours. Basically, they're useless. They're very good for TV. They offer a degree of confidence. We've taken that into account in our assessment. That level, that feeling from the community that government is doing something at the airport by using the thermal scanners is quite powerful. But the truth of the matter is that they're not worth having. They take up human resources, they require maintenance, they're very expensive, and those resources could be better used.
It seems that before this flight came from Hanoi in Vietnam, a few travellers arrived from Hong Kong before they became ill, and they've been travelling all over the country. Pretty quickly, there are reports of suspected cases of this foul plague in Queensland, South Australia, and also here in Victoria, and the numbers are rising rapidly. Garry, do you start by testing everyone who's sick who turns up at a doctor's? How do you assess how many cases you're dealing with?
So in the very early stages, there would be a lot of testing done, but we're working now in an issue where we have to be very mindful of laboratory capacity and laboratory capability. And one other wrinkle that you may not have considered is that under the National Health Security Act, Section 3, there's a list of things that the Minister determines known as security-sensitive biological agents. A highly pathogenic influenza virus, and if we're being told that this is highly clinically significant with high transmissibility, may meet the criteria to become a security-sensitive biological agent. Under those circumstances, anybody handling that particular influenza virus is handling what the Americans know as select agents, what we call security-sensitive biological agents.
That means very few laboratories could actually deal with it.
That means very few laboratories will want to deal with it unless we make modifications to the regulations and the legislation. We try to make sure that in the very early stages there is quite a lot of laboratory testing just to make sure that we are getting the answer right. But at a certain point, you get to a stage where the clinical presentation becomes typical, people recognise it, and the real need for laboratory testing has gone. Fortunately, we're in a stage of technology where we can do high throughput testing, but even then, you will exhaust all of the medical laboratory scientists, all of the technicians, all of the reception staff in pathology laboratories, not to mention the pathologists and others.
Well, you talk about exhausting the pathologists and the laboratory staff. What about you, Rod, down at your clinics in Adelaide and on the York Peninsula? What are you seeing? Are you seeing a lot of worried well turn up? Are you seeing a lot of sick people, and how are you handling it?
We're getting questions every day, getting more and more of them, that everyone that's got a slight fever, all our chest pains are now not thinking they've got heart attacks, where they think they've got the flu. And I've just had someone call me to say that their cousin has just got back from Hong Kong, and they think they were with a group. So I'm not sure whether, well, I don't know whether I want to go and see them because I can't take any prevention. My staff are telling me they're worried about anyone coming to see them. We're seeing people in the car park who think they're sick. So we're not sure we want to go and actually see them in the car park, so maybe keep the window up. I'm looking for some protective stuff because I was told that I was going to get protective gear. So, and if the vaccine isn't, the antivirals aren't going to work, I can't protect myself. So I'm kind of,
So what are you looking for? You're looking for what, gowns and masks and gloves?
Well, I need reassurance from Sharon that if I get someone, either my staff or my doctors or someone I've got who's sick, that they'll look after them in the hospital. I need to see whether Gary's going to reassure me. Is like, he's telling me all the things that don't work. Is there anything that does work? What am I going to do? I've got some cases. There's one or two who I seriously think are at risk, and I'm not sure quite what I need to do, let alone what do I do with all my other patients who are coming to see me. And they don't want to go to the flu clinic because that's where people are sick. They want to come and see someone who isn't sick.
Well, Garry, let me ask you about that. You've got an entire national stockpile, which I assume has got things in it like goggles and masks and gowns. Or
We've
maybe
got some stuff, yeah.
So have you fed that through to your GPs at the front line?
So basically, under the arrangements that we've got with states and territories, and I think it's important to mention, particularly for the audience, under the Constitution, healthcare delivery is a responsibility of states and territories. The Australian government's role is around coordination. So while we fund and maintain a national medical stockpile, that particular stockpile gets deployed to states and territories. And given that the Australians living in those states and territories as residents are the responsibility from a healthcare delivery perspective, we rely on our not only the coordination mechanisms that we have in place with states and territories, but significantly trust that they have in place their own plans.
But you know, last time, Garry, we only got about a third of the things we ordered. We ordered them and we didn't get them.
I realise that, and that's why through the lessons that were identified and learned from 2009, we've made significant inroads into the processes involved for the National Medical Stockpile as well as the plan in general.
Although at the same time, it has to be said, we heard earlier from Russell that making the seasonal flu vaccine is a bit of a dry run, if you like, for making a vaccine for this. And we had trouble just this year with the seasonal flu vaccine. A lot of GPs in a lot of states couldn't get it. So does that inspire faith that if there was a pandemic, everything that is needed would find its way to where it's needed?
From our perspective, at least from an Australian government perspective, we have in place the contracts with Securus. We have in place the arrangements with the states and territories around the acquisition, distribution of the particular products, whether it be vaccine or other elements of PPE.
That's a personal protective. Essentially, you're blaming the states. You're saying they have got it, they should pass it on.
Oh, far from it. There's no way we could blame the states. States and territories work in cooperation. Unlike other parts of government where there's a lot of infighting, in health protection, our relationship with states and territories is really very, very good.
Sharon, what's happening at the Alfred Hospital? I mean, you'd be seeing enormous numbers of people turn up to your emergency department. Do you send every one but the most urgent cases home? How do you handle it?
This happened in 2009 about what to do with GPs when people ring up. There was recommendations to gauge how sick that person was, perhaps not to get everyone into the clinic. It was real. People actually were advised to come in and you'd come out and see them in the car park. There were you would establish dedicated flu clinics. And then I think one area of really quite sophisticated planning and coordination goes around essential services, which essential services must continue because people still get sick and have heart attacks and need urgent surgery. And so which hospitals will be responsible for maintaining those services, which hospitals might just focus on flu.
Well indeed. And Malik, what should be going on to try and work that out? I mean, do you try and take a very broad sample of the population at this point so that you do know how widespread it was, bearing in mind that during swine flu in 2009, there was an assumption at the beginning that it was way more infectious than it actually turned out to be?
Yes, that's right. So the early estimates of severity, fatality with swine flu was 100 times more than what it turned out to be. And that makes a huge difference in public perception, public concern, and everything like that. After the 2009 pandemic, in fact, one of the criticisms or one of the points that was identified by the Feinberg Commission that looked into the WHO and global response to the pandemic, one of the things they identified was the need to assess severity early. So one of the things we did in 2009 was to do serial blood sampling in the population, week by week.
And you do that in part by accessing people who have donated blood.
So that is one ready source of samples. The other source is patients who come into hospital for taking blood for whatever reason. And of course, the ideal way is to do a planned study, but that really gave us a lot of information in fairly real time, because by testing their blood, we know what age groups are getting infected, what the denominator of infection is, and then you can relate it to the fatality, because sometimes, quite often, the denominator is so huge that the fatality rate you see is just the tip of the iceberg. And when you put the denominator in, actually the rate could be much lower.
That said, though, this disease is still continuing to spread, and it is targeting the very young as well as older members of the community. At the WHO and elsewhere, I assume that it is all hands on deck now to try and find a vaccine.
Absolutely. The technology exists now, and Russell mentioned it as well. The technology exists now to go from sequence data, and you can synthesize a gene and generate a vaccine from that. So that is a possibility. Now, both would probably be pursued. And in addition, in a crisis like this, in today's world, a number of different companies might try different platforms to try to identify additional experimental vaccines as well.
Because, of course, this is a global pandemic. Australia is not the only one affected. Russell, how are you going on the vaccine front?
So we've started because departments rung us up and said, get going. Seasonal vaccine is now irrelevant because actually the virus displaces all the regular viruses, flu viruses that were there previously. So like everyone else, we divert resources and the rest of the work continues, but we hunker down and really focus on this. We are establishing relationships with the hospitals, warning them we're going to need to do clinical trials very quickly while we're making the vaccine, and then so we can, all the bureaucracy is overcome. And in fact, that's what happened in 2009, and it was very smooth. The borders, all the bureaucratic things that people get worried about normally just melted away, and there was great cooperation.
Well, everyone on our panel is being absolutely run off their feet. This disease is spreading rapidly across Australia. There are now tens of thousands of cases in every state except Tasmania, which has chosen to effectively shut its borders. Not a decision the federal government supports, but they consider it's only a matter of time before it gets to Tasmania anyway, and they've got bigger fish to fry. The most severe cases are overrunning the hospitals and also the flu clinics that have been set up. Some 30% of the workforce has been affected, either people who are sick or they're looking after members of family who are sick, and the death rate is rising. It is, as I said, affecting young people and older people in the main. Garry, the conversation around the National Incident Control Room has turned fairly urgently to the question of whether you should now shut schools and start limiting public transport, or what even things like, you know, the local football event. How does that discussion unfold?
So these are not new discussions. Mass gatherings, schools, they're all important aspects where, particularly for respiratory viruses, where we consider that children are often very good spreaders of infection, it's often seen as logical to be able to close schools and keep children at home. But obviously, when you keep children at home, you're effectively removing something like up to 30% of the workforce, because somebody's got to look after those children. And if they're at home, you can't have them in childcare or other places, because
and that's
that defeats the
30%
purpose.
on top of the 30%
That's
who
right.
are already out anyway.
That's right. So we're in a situation where if the disease is that severe, if the clinical severity has been determined to be that severe, if the transmissibility has been determined to be that severe, then those decisions have to be discussed at a whole of government level, not only in Australian government but also in states and territories.
Sharon, what would your advice be? I mean, if you said, yes, shut the schools, you'd be well aware that at places like the Alfred, you'll lose even more of your staff when you just so desperately need them.
Oh, absolutely. So the decisions on limiting, public contact is very much a government decision. Another big issue that we can often face in this setting, and I think Malik can speak to this, is there's a lot of fear of our hospital staff. So it's not as if everyone's coming to work saying, I don't care, I'll stay here until I get sick. You start getting tremendous fear about even coming to work. So it's not even just sick people that aren't coming. There's people that are worried and don't want to take it home to their families. So managing the communications around that, making sure that your staff feel safe to come to work, requires a really big effort, and that was really tested, I think, in SARS.
With the experience of SARS, of course, many things happened. Schools were shut, yes. People were wearing masks of their own accord. I mean, it was not necessarily advocated, but people started doing that, and people reduced going out, for social, out for dinner, in the shops, So the number of people out and about was markedly reduced, except essential, going to work. Now, what we did see was that in retrospect, when we looked at that period of SARS, we saw that other respiratory infections, the incidence of other respiratory infections actually fell. So these measures overall, the total behavior of the population, partly because of fear, partly because of masks, or I don't know whether it's masks or whether it's closure of schools or the total reduction of people moving around, it did seem to reduce the spread of at least of other respiratory infections. So clearly they do seem to have an impact. Now, which of these things work and how we deploy them is another issue. And as was pointed out, some of these measures have other consequences.
Indeed, closing the schools has very large consequences. Rod, how are you going in South Australia? Have you got enough staff who are both well enough and prepared to work to keep your clinics going?
Yeah, I've lost a couple of doctors because they're looking after... Unfortunately, no one's died yet, but I'm still kind of desperate to know, is there anything that actually makes a clinical difference? Because I'm going to try some protection. Probably the stuff I've got isn't going to provide guarantees, but the staff I've got working want some protection. But I want to hear from the experts, and Sharon particularly, or who's working in the hospital, to say, is there any particular group that we've got to look out for clinically? So there's a whole lot of clinical decisions. What is it? Is it the chest pains and the seizures that really is the heralding of the stuff? Is that, or what else? So, and do I have them on prophylactic antibiotics, because it doesn't sound like the antivirals are working? So I'm getting really nervous at the impotence at the front line, and it's just this sense of helplessness. It's like there's really nothing I can do here.
And that's, of course, that's not Sharon's personal fault, but well, one would imagine that if this is immune to most antivirals, even if it proves not immune to some of the ones that Malik mentioned, they're not available in the doses and the amount that you would need. So essentially, what can you do to help these patients?
I'd be hoping that there'd be some clinical feedback. With these guys usually at this stage, and you're using your informal networks to hear that, we're trying something, this seems to be working, or we're doing this to people, or, we're putting them in a hot bath or a cold bath. Or, there must be something to help. Well, we're hoping, we're relying on these guys to give us some clues what we can do clinically.
By this point, would you have something, do you think?
Well, there would be a lot of work on looking at agents that perhaps were in early development, which Malik talked about earlier. Again, if we come to use some of those, there is a process of the fact that you're using a drug that hasn't yet been licensed, and how you might do a clinical trial that's fairly urgent. And actually that's one thing that we have been working on in this network of preparedness, of getting pre-approved protocols to use drugs in exactly this setting should something like this happen. And in fact, that system was tested a bit with Ebola just recently, where there were potential antivirals not yet licensed, and there was a big and very important ethical discussion about how you use untested drugs. I think but being pragmatic, I think is exactly what Rob was talking about, was who is the people that we need to worry about most. We haven't talked about Indigenous populations.
Which were very hard hit in 2009, and you see a number of...
And the pregnant women was a cohort we weren't expecting, because we were expecting old people. They seem to be survived, but we're hearing it's the young and the elderly, so we're particularly concerned about them.
Yeah, people with other comorbidities, with renal disease, or on any other agents that suppress their immune system. And while we don't have an active antiviral, so we've been talking all about how you prevent new infections, which we can prevent with antivirals and vaccines, but then how you manage someone that's sick, it would be supportive care. Making sure I don't think we'd use prophylactic antibiotics. We'd want to minimise antibiotic use, but treat at the very earliest sign. And supportive care meaning that when people get very sick, and their fluids don't work properly, and they may need supportive care for their hearts or their kidneys. So they're that's where this extra effort goes.
Garry, this is one potential flaw in the plan, isn't it? That you've got frontline GPs across the country who you really rely on to look after many people who are affected in a pandemic, but they're running their own small businesses. They face their own challenges, and as a federal government and a federal health service, you have very limited leverage. You can't say, Rod, you must keep your practice open.
Big lessons that we learned from 2009 is the importance of communication. We mentioned before, and Malik mentioned, we need to define what we know, what we don't know, what we're doing and what we're going to do. And for general practitioners who are the front line in terms of healthcare for the community, one of the constructs that we developed was something known as the GP Roundtable. Now, while that is just a committee structure and it involves the major medical societies for general practitioners as well as practice managers, etc., it is an efficient mechanism of getting information out to general practitioners, as well as using the AMA and other communication methods like that.
But I guess that communication is absolutely
right.
key, but how do you ensure the message? I mean, for example, Rod, you get called constantly by local media who are wanting your words of wisdom. You need to be on the same page as what the government's saying. Do you check the website, check your emails, see what they've said, read the transcripts, look at social media, and then answer to the people who are asking you for interviews? I mean, how do you all make sure that you're on the same page?
Well, I think, like some of the conversation started, if I get a question that I kind of got a bit of a feel for an answer, but I'm not really sure of, I'll ring Garry or ring Sharon or ring Malik or something and say, look, we've discussed this question. It's like, it's a good question. The official line is this, but what's the real line? You know, does it really work? Does it?
But you have to give the official line, don't you?
Well, not so much, I guess, but not to be dishonest. It's exactly that. The nuance has got to be appropriate, not to scare people. And if I'm talking on radio, it's got to be based on fact. It's got to be based on material that I would tell the patient as much as I'll tell the community. So it's got to be honest and it's got to be open and say, look, I can help with this, I can't do this. Maybe we can't answer that. So I like to know the story behind the fact as well as what the official line is, and I will nuance my message as honestly as I can, because that's ultimately important and that's clinical integrity. But you kind of got to know the backstory as well as the official line. Otherwise, and that's where I need to have these relationships already working.
That's 35,000 GPs who need to know a backstory. That's a lot of people, isn't it?
That's right.
Big challenge.
It is.
But there actually are some very efficient ways of getting information on public health to GPs by state governments and federal governments, and that happens all the time. You know, we have, you know, new diagnoses of measles, and an alert will go out. But when things are going this fast, the communications is absolutely essential.
For the first time since foul plague was declared a global pandemic last year, health authorities say there's real hope a vaccine will be available within days. 45 million people have been infected across the globe, with more than 3.5 million killed by the virus. In Australia, close to 200,000 have been infected, with 15,978 deaths. The nation's health system is on the verge of collapse, economic growth has stalled, and the financial cost is already running into the billions of dollars. All eyes are now on the vaccine expected to be released by the end of the week. The world is desperate for some relief.
Russell, your vaccine is going to be ready by the end of the week. Are you confident it's going to work?
Yes, we've done all the appropriate testing. It's been rapidly through the bureaucracy of oversight through the Therapeutics Goods Administration, our regulator. We have data that we understand. It's not going to be perfect, but it will certainly reduce the burden of the disease.
So the big question, how much of it can you make in the first batch?
So by April next year, we will have made sufficient for 2 doses for each of the population of Australia.
And that's by April next year, but you wouldn't wait till you had 2 doses for every person before you released it, would you?
No, we'd be releasing it in coordination with the TGA and the government, the government purchases it and they will make the decision about who it goes to first.
Garry, that's your question. Who gets this vaccine?
So we're obviously in the action phase, the targeted action phase. We know a lot more about the virus. We know a lot more about the infection. Hopefully we understand who the vulnerable groups are. So it's those vulnerable groups that are really important. At the same time, we need to be aware that healthcare workers who are caring for those who are sick also need to be protected, and we would be looking at them as well.
But you can't give it to both. You won't have enough to give it to every healthcare worker, every community leader, every politician. politician, potentially every security official, and every
I said
young
healthcare
person.
worker.
So is that literally healthcare workers first, then the most vulnerable?
Again, these are decisions that are made whole of government with states and territories, but healthcare workers are very important in terms of caring for the sick. No one's suggesting at all that politicians aren't important or that essential workers, fireys and ambulance officers are also not important, as well as people that work in banks. But the reality is we've got a very sick, growing number of sick people with a growing number of deaths, and we need to make some decisions about how we can minimise that and how we can reduce transmission.
And Rod, how would that be going down at your clinics? You'd be saying pretty much to most of your patients that the most vulnerable, you'll get it. Your staff, you might get it. The rest, you'll have to wait.
Yeah, and if someone thinks they've had the infection but we weren't able to prove it, I would rely on the data that I think Russell's talking about. So can I give it to everyone? It doesn't matter if they've been infected because I want to protect everyone. I want my staff probably first because they want to go out there and they want it to be as secure as possible. Still got to be concerned. And then the high-risk groups, which I still think I've heard are the elderly, maybe some pregnancy. But yeah, I need some advice and follow that, and we'd start that strategy and try to roll it out and hope that the supply is there as promised. If Russell's good at his word and we can believe the companies, and of course the state government will be helping us, we hope, rolling it out.
Sharon, how many people need to be vaccinated before you really curb this virus? 70% of the population? 60% of the population?
I think the most important thing about this is that whatever plan is decided, it's based on some evidence and it's logical so that it makes sense to people at the front line. They can explain it to people.
And that would be a huge relief in your hospital, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so that you understand it's the people that are at most risk of getting complications, and some of the, healthcare workers, essential staff. So you do have to have a plan that makes sense, because what often happens in this setting is you get some hysteria around, I've got to have that vaccine, and you may not be the person that really needs it. So that, again, needs a lot of a very logical plan based on some degree of evidence and really well communicated. Otherwise, you get hysteria.
Just to be clear, I think we take for granted that we have an onshore vaccine manufacturing capability. There are maybe 10 or 12 countries in the world. We have agreements, we have plants in England, Australia and America, and have very similar agreements that to provide vaccine to that country until they say we don't need any more. And there's no second grabs for other countries. So there's a first, there's a queue. So there's a lot of pressure in that circumstance. And that's why having an agreement with the Australian government now that it's in place and we know we don't have to negotiate, we understand the terms, that's very helpful to make sure there's clarity, and then we can deal with other countries like Singapore and New Zealand in the region that we do have agreements with to give them certainty.
Malik, does a vaccine mean that this crisis is over?
Well, if you're, as was mentioned before, so it depends on what proportion of the population that has been infected and whether the remainder has been fully vaccinated and effectively vaccinated and the vaccine is effective. Now, keep in mind that according to your time scale, so the vaccine is now being rolled out around April.
We're about 7 months in.
And so the influenza has a seasonality. I mean, it prefers the winter months. So you are now heading into the winter months, and you would actually expect an upsurge of infection. So if there are any vulnerable, unvaccinated, uninfected segments of the population, you might have a second wave. I mean, in many countries in 2009, the second wave was worse than the first. So that's one problem. The second problem, of course, is that, over time, of course, influenza is an ever-changing virus, and it will adapt to evade vaccine protection. But very likely that won't happen in that first year.
We leave our hypothetical not entirely comfortable that this never-before-seen strain of influenza has been wiped out, but certainly comfortable that for the moment at least, the worst is over, until such time, of course, as yet another virus jumps the species. It's happened before. We know it will happen again. Please join me in thanking our panel very much.